Good evening and welcome to Gravitas. I'm Palki Sharma Upadhyay. Let's get started. The Taliban are in power. They've got a note of congratulations. From whom? The Al-Qaeda. They're talking about Kashmir. Liberating Kashmir, as they put it. And this is our world. Terrorist groups are cheering each other on social media. Where are the world powers? They're busy lying, shifting blame, and legitimizing the Taliban. Qatar says isolating the Taliban would be counterproductive. China says Afghanistan has turned a new page. Their embassy, remember, is operational in Kabul. Germany says there is no alternative to talks. The UK is already talking to them. They had a meeting in Doha on more evacuations. Europe sees this largely as a refugee crisis. Basically, they don't want more Afghan migrants. As for Asia, it's already a security crisis. The Taliban's rise has triggered a new wave of jihad. From Bangladesh to Indonesia to the Philippines, countries are reporting activity. India is on alert. The Prime Minister has set up a special group to deal with the evolving security situation and the implications for India. On Gravitas tonight, we'll bring you all the details. Also on the show, leaked transcripts of the last phone call between US President Biden and Afghan President Ghani expose Biden's lies. We'll tell you what he said. Americans have lost their longest war and now they're fighting with their oldest ally, Britain, over who is to blame. Don't miss our report on the war of words on the Kabul airport attack. As the world focuses on Afghanistan, China is pushing with its world domination plans. They've opened a rail link to the Indian Ocean via Myanmar. We'll tell you why New Delhi should be concerned. And why are children on anti-depressants? An alarming number of them. According to a new report, we'll tell you what experts say about this trend. We begin, as always, with Gravitas Global Headlines.
Following the Taliban's takeover in Afghanistan, the Al-Qaeda terror group has congratulated the Taliban. In its statement, the Al-Qaeda mentions Kashmir while calling for the liberation of Islamic lands. Another vial of Moderna's COVID-19 vaccine suspected of containing a foreign substance has been found in Japan's Kanagawa prefecture. The rest of the batch has been put on hold after a pharmacist found several black particles in one vial. Last week, Japan suspected the use of 1.63 million doses of Moderna shots due to a similar issue. In a fresh bid to tighten control over the country's tech sector, China has rolled out a new data security law, seeking to oversee what tech giants do with information from their hundreds of millions of users. Beijing has flagged national security concerns as justification for the law. A day after India announced GDP numbers registering a record GDP growth of 20.1% for the first quarter, Indian markets touched record high levels. The Sensex touched the 57,900 mark in the morning trade. The optimism in the stock markets is also backed by record daily COVID-19 vaccinations in the country, crossing the 10 million mark. Lawmakers in South Korea have passed a bill that requires all hospitals to place cameras in operation theaters after a series of medical accidents involving unqualified staff who stood in for surgeons. The Greek Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis replaced his public order and tourism ministers on Tuesday following sharp criticism of the government's response to wildfires. More than 250,000 hectares of pine forests were destroyed in August by blazes that burned for several days across Greece. According to a new study, at least 30% of the world's tree species face extinction in the wild. Experts say that at least 17,500 tree species are at risk, ranging from oaks to tropical timber trees. Nearly 142 species have already vanished. Almost half of Louisiana state is bracing for a month without power and reliable water supply in the aftermath of Hurricane Ida. The state, which is home to nearly 5 million people, has been the worst hit. World number 1 Novak Djokovic's bid for a record 21st major singles title and the first calendar year Grand Slam in men's tennis since 1969 is up and running at the US Open. The Serbian was pushed harder than expected by Danish 18-year-old Holger Rune, but he overcame a patch of wobbly form to win in 4 sets. Rune raised hopes of a spectacular upset by winning the second set in a tiebreak, but he suffered severe cramping from there and Djokovic pounced to close out a 6-2, 6-7, 6-2, 6-1 victory. England captain Joe Root is now the world's number 1 ranked Test batsman on the back of his spectacular form in the ongoing series against India. In the 3 tests played so far, Root has already plundered 507 runs at an average of 126.75, with 3 centuries and a 50. He has now overtaken New Zealand's Kane Williamson and is back at the helm of the rankings for the first time since December 2015. The 4th test between England and India starts on Thursday at the Oval in London.
What's life like under Taliban rule? Let me show you some pictures. These came overnight from Khost in Afghanistan, and this is not a real funeral. This is the Taliban celebrating America's departure with fake coffins. They're draped with American, French, British and NATO flags. The humiliation of the West does not end there. Look at this now, the Taliban parading with their loot. What they took from Americans and Afghans, that's on display. One such parade happened in Kandahar today. The Taliban showed off American military vehicles. They were armed with heavy weapons and machine guns. At least 1 Black Hawk helicopter was seen flying over Kandahar. These are America's gifts to a terrorist group: legitimacy, a 2.0 makeover, and world-class weapons. What did they give the people of Afghanistan? No choice, more misery. Our correspondent Anas Malik went out to survey the streets of Kabul today. Thousands are waiting outside banks, and this is not an exaggeration. Look at these images. All of these people struggling to get their own money out.
17 days of the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan, the banks are pretty much dysfunctional. Thousands line up every morning outside this prominent private bank of Afghanistan in a bid to collect cash. They complain that for the week, they're only allowed to take about $200 or 20,000 Afghanis out. Hundreds and hundreds of people have been waiting in order to get money to run their daily affairs.
What about the Kabul airport? No crowds there. No roar of engines. The Taliban have taken charge, you see. Their special force, the Badri 313, is on guard. They had a victory parade at the airport too, and an inspection of the machines the Americans left behind. There were more than 70 military aircraft at the Kabul airport. The Americans believe they've left them unusable. Smashed windows, damaged equipment, deflated tires. They're most likely just worthless heaps of metal now. And if this wasn't dramatic enough, we have a Talib riding a tricycle through the mess. These pictures sum up Afghanistan, a glorious mess with armed men riding around. Is nobody going to stand up to them? Some Afghans are. They're in Panjshir, keeping the resistance alive. The Taliban launched a siege on the province. The resistance forces pushed them back. The Taliban tried to talk to them, but the negotiations failed. So the Taliban have decided to fight again. They've surrounded the valley. Both sides are gearing up for action. The resistant forces have built up their own armory. This video, the one that you see, emerged last month. It shows the military equipment they have. At least 3 helicopters and a dozen military vehicles. How many fighters? Anywhere between 7 and 10,000. Is this enough to thwart a Taliban attack? In a country where psychological victories lead to takeovers, anything is possible. The Taliban are confident they're here to stay. They're looking at forming a government, and their role model is an unlikely one: Shia Iran. The Taliban want to install an Islamic theocracy, where one man called the supreme leader exercises complete control over the country. There'll be elections, they say, but religious leaders will have the last word. Like in Iran, it's Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran. Who will be the supreme leader of Afghanistan? This man, perhaps. Hibatullah Akhundzada, the Taliban chief, who's now said to be in Kandahar. Why is he hiding? The Taliban fear that he could be attacked. So he remains in the shadows, reportedly with Pakistani security. This is the only picture of him on the internet. What is he doing there? He's deciding the shape of the government. What would the Islamic Emirates power structure look like? There'll be Akhundzada on the top, probably presiding over a supreme council that runs the country. So you could say that Akhundzada will be Afghanistan's Khamenei. He will head a supreme council with anywhere between 11 and 72 members. Plus, there'll be a governing council to look after the day-to-day functioning of the country. This will be headed by a prime minister who will have his council of ministers. There's still no clarity on how many people will be finally accommodated, but there are clear indications as to who will take the top jobs. Starting with the prime minister. This man, and it will be a man, will be the second most powerful one in Afghanistan, the prime minister of the country. There are 2 contenders for the post: Mullah Baradar, the co-founder of the Taliban, also its international face now, and Mullah Yaqub, the son of Mullah Omar, the original founder of the Taliban. Then we have Mullah Hakim, a former associate of Mullah Omar. He could be the chief justice, leading the judiciary. Do you know what's common among all these names? All of them are terrorists. None has experience in running a government. But then again, if you're the Taliban, do qualifications even matter? It's loyalty that counts. A week before America retreated from Afghanistan, the Taliban made some of these appointments. Some are still being made. They installed loyalists to posts of authority. And you may not have heard of most of these people, but they will be the ones running Afghanistan now. Abdul Baqi was made the acting head of higher education. Sadr Ibrahim was named as the acting interior minister. Gul Agha was appointed as the finance minister. Mullah Shireen was made the new governor of Kabul. And Haji Najibullah was appointed as Afghanistan's intelligence chief. I want to focus on one appointment. The Taliban's new intelligence chief, Haji Najibullah, also known as Mullah Najibullah. Who is this man? He's unlike many in the Taliban's ranks. He's not a Pashtun. He's not a core part of the Taliban. He operates a splinter faction. And at one point, he was said to be a serious threat to the Taliban leadership. Then why has Najibullah been made the intelligence chief? And why must you know about him? Here's a report.
His name is Mullah Najibullah. But the Taliban call him Haji Najibullah, a title one earns after performing the holy pilgrimage of Hajj. Yet, like everyone else in the Taliban's ranks, Najibullah is anything but holy. He has a reputation for brutally beheading any prisoner he takes. This story begins in 1994. When Najibullah joined the Taliban at the age of 15. Despite being a non-Pashtun from the Zabul province, he rose through the Taliban's ranks due to his radically imposing personality. By 1997, he was appointed a sub-commander by Taliban leader Mullah Dadullah. Under Dadullah's tutelage, Najibullah carried out several kidnappings and attacks across the country. After the Taliban fell in 2001, Najibullah retreated to his home, the Zabul province, which is strategically located along the Pakistan border. This is when he is said to have come in touch with Pakistan's ISI. The Taliban leadership, especially Mullah Dadullah, treated him as a valuable player. He was made the commander of hundreds of suicide bombers and the operational chief of a new insurgent force. When Dadullah died in a 2007 raid, Najibullah took over most of his late mentor's forces. The very next year, Najibullah carried out the high-profile kidnapping of New York Times reporter David Rode. He was held hostage by Najibullah's men in the North Waziristan province. The kidnapping was reportedly carried out with the help of the ISI. 4 years later, in 2012, Najibullah left the Taliban. Why? Because they had opened a political office in Qatar. He openly referred to the Taliban leadership as traitors, and he formed his own faction, the Fidai Mehez or Sacrifice Front, which in 2013 carried out an unusual suicide attack on the Indian consulate in Jalalabad. Most evidence pointed at the ISI's involvement in this attack. This was 8 years back. Now, ISI henchman Najibullah has been named the Taliban's intel chief. Why would they appoint a dissenter to such an important post? Perhaps to make it easier for Pakistan to facilitate the Taliban's future operations. Bureau Report, WION World is One.
With the Taliban in Kabul, global jihad has a new capital, a safe house where terrorists can plot, hide and rally. It's quite similar to 2014 when the Islamic State captured Mosul in Iraq. Suddenly jihadists had a country, they had an oil economy, they had plenty of abandoned equipment. Mosul was a big scoop for global jihad. Afghanistan is even bigger. We're talking about 652,000 square kilometers of land, untapped minerals worth $1 trillion and an arsenal of American weapons. No wonder the jihadists are upbeat. On Tuesday, Al-Qaeda released this statement on the Taliban's return. They're calling it a congratulatory note, but frankly, it's a dire warning. Let me quote from this message for the Taliban. This is what the Al-Qaeda says. We congratulate the Islamic Ummah on its historic victory that has been achieved at the hands of the resolute Afghan nation. A symbol of resistance against invading imperialist powers, Afghanistan is undoubtedly an impregnable fortress of Islam. Well drafted for Al-Qaeda. It's also jarring. Terror groups giving each other shout-outs on social media. That's the first part of the Al-Qaeda statement. The second part is even more worrisome. You see, the Taliban may have accomplished their mission, but the jihadists elsewhere have not. Their ambitions are global. So let me go back to the statement, and this is what it says. Dear Ummah, it's time for you to prepare for the next stage of the struggle. This historic victory will open way for Muslim masses to achieve liberation from despotic rule of tyrants who have been imposed by the West on the Islamic world. It goes on. And pay attention. Liberate the Levant, Somalia, Yemen, Kashmir, and the rest of the Islamic lands from the clutches of the enemies of Islam. So much for a congratulatory note. This is a war cry, a renaissance of global jihad, and it is right at India's doorsteps. The Al-Qaeda says it wants to liberate Kashmir. Does the Taliban agree? On paper, no. Last year, they promised to cut off all ties with the Al-Qaeda, and recently they've promised to not interfere in Kashmir. But remember, these are the Al-Qaeda's promises, not worth very much. Here's what intelligence reports say. Jihadists from Lashkar-e-Toiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed are already in Afghanistan. They're getting weapons and training. In fact, Jaish leaders met with the Taliban last month in Kandahar. They wanted to help in quote-unquote India-centric operations. We don't know how the Taliban responded. But here's what we do know. These jihadists are a wounded lot. They're still recovering from the war on terror, which means their capacity is limited. Right now, they cannot strike the US or Europe. So what can they do? They can certainly target the neighborhood. India is preparing for this eventuality. Reports say the Prime Minister has constituted a high-level group to monitor Afghanistan. And this includes the Foreign Minister, the National Security Advisor, and other senior officials. One of their objectives is to ensure that Afghanistan remains terror-free. That's a tall ask. It's going to be run by what used to be called a terror group. This new jihad will not stop in India or South Asia, though. It is extending to new frontiers. One of them is Southeast Asia. The entire region is on the lookout for Taliban and ISIS sympathizers. Let me tell you what each country is doing. In Indonesia, anti-terrorism corps are sweeping through social media. They arrested 58 terrorists last month. They were planning an attack on the 17th of August, Indonesia's Independence Day. The Philippines has signed intelligence sharing agreements with its neighbors. The government says local extremism is a big problem. Their concern is the southern island of Mindanao. For half a century, the government has been fighting Islamists on this island. Afghanistan is not good news for the government there. Malaysia had a first-hand experience with Afghan radicalization. Last month, the Taliban detained 2 Malaysian nationals, both allegedly linked to ISIS Khorasan. Clearly, Asia is bracing for a new wave of jihad, and this is not just about weapons and funding. This is about setting a precedent. The Taliban toppled a democratically elected government. What did the world do? Practically nothing. This will embolden terror groups across Asia, make them feel invincible. What can governments do in response? Waiting for the Americans is not an option. The war on terror is all but over as far as the US is concerned. Asian countries will have to coordinate. I'm talking about intelligence sharing here. I'm talking about diplomatic pressure, joint operations. For most of the last decade, West Asia was the capital of global jihad. It's now shifted to Afghanistan, slap bang in the middle of Central and East Asia. If the world does not prepare, the Afghan emirate could become a caliphate. Not today, not tomorrow, but gradually. So we need a new push. Who will lead this new war on terror? It's still too early to say, but I can tell you who shouldn't lead this war. Joe Biden. He couldn't manage an evacuation, so war certainly seems too much. The president's approval ratings are falling faster than Kabul. His allies are questioning his decisions. What does Joe Biden do? Hold a press conference from every room at the White House. The same script, the same excuses, just different emotions. The latest was on Tuesday. This time we saw a combative Joe Biden. He had threats for ISIS Khorasan, blame for Donald Trump, but no answers for why he messed up. All responsibility lies with the Afghan army and leadership now. Turns out that was not the case. Biden and Ashraf Ghani last spoke to each other on the 23rd of July. The transcript of that phone call is now out. Listen to what Biden told Ghani. And I'm quoting again. This is Joe Biden telling Ashraf Ghani, the perception around the world and in parts of Afghanistan, I believe, is that things are not going well in terms of the fight against the Taliban, and there is a need, whether it is true or not, there is a need to project a different picture. Sounds like a smoking gun to me. Biden knew that the tide was changing. He knew that people were expecting the Taliban to win. And what did he do? Order some PR work. Project a different picture, whether true or not, he says. Joe Biden's words. He was busy managing perception. While the Taliban were running over Afghanistan. There's more from the phone call. We are also going to continue to make sure your Air Force is capable of continuing to fly and provide air support. This was Joe Biden telling a complete lie. Most US contractors left Afghanistan after July 1st. They were based in the Bagram airfield. And once Bagram was handed over, they left. Imagine if your teacher disappeared a week before your exam. You would feel helpless. That's exactly what the US did. 22 days after that phone call, Kabul fell. Neither men were remotely aware of how badly they were losing. And for Joe Biden, it's a personal defeat. And I mean quite literally. Let me tell you a story from 2008. Then Senator Joe Biden was touring Afghanistan with his colleagues. His helicopter was caught in a snowstorm. They had to land in some remote Afghan valley. The pilot sounded an urgent call to US soldiers nearby. They set out on a Humvee to find the senators. For the next few hours, one man guided these American troops through rough weather and mountains. He was an Afghan guide who goes by the name Mohammed, the man who rescued Joe Biden. Guess where he is now? He's stuck in Afghanistan, hiding in his house with his family. Mohammed's visa is stuck in processing, but he hasn't lost hope. He says Joe Biden is the American president. He can do anything. And that really sums up the Biden presidency. High expectations, dismal results. The president is already talking about the future. As if Afghanistan is a closed chapter, he says America is preparing for the threats of 2021 and beyond.
As we close 20 years of war and strife and pain and sacrifice, it's time to look at the future, not the past. The fundamental obligation of a president, in my opinion, is to defend and protect America, not against threats of 2001, but against the threats of 2021 and tomorrow.
That was Joe Biden saying, job done, time to move on. Well, easy for him to say that. Biden promised to hunt ISIS Khorasan terrorists to the end of the earth. But he had no words for Afghan women or his own allies stuck in Afghanistan. Apparently, that's up to the Taliban. These blunders have destabilized the whole region. A new wave of terror is rising from Afghanistan. Unfortunately, the world cannot hold Biden or his team accountable. Only America can. 90 US veterans are calling for Pentagon Chief Lloyd Austin and Top General Mark Milley to resign. They argue that Austin and Milley should have advised against the withdrawal. But the blame does not stop with the military. What about the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken? He failed to evacuate coalition allies. His State Department could not speed up visas for Afghan refugees. Republicans want him to resign or face impeachment. But let's be real here. When was the last time American leaders accepted responsibility for anything? Take it the Iraq invasion, for instance. It's been 18 years. We are still waiting for those nuclear weapons, those weapons of mass destruction, as they call them. Joe Biden is no different. Neither will he admit his mistakes, nor make amends for them. And America's criminal botch-up in Afghanistan is receiving condemnation from all quarters, even from its closest ally, the United Kingdom. For quite some time now, Britain has been blaming the US for letting Afghanistan slip into chaos. Now, America has fired the first shots. The tensions have reached a tipping point, courtesy the Kabul airport bombing. On the 27th of August, the ISIS Khorasan carried out a suicide blast at the Kabul airport. 13 American service members were killed. The US is blaming Britain for creating an environment that led to this attack. Some Pentagon documents have been leaked. They suggest that the US had kept Kabul airport's Abbey Gate open so that Britain's evacuation efforts could continue. And this is what the State Department documents say. Britain's evacuation efforts could continue despite knowing there was a high risk of attack. They further state that Abbey Gate was not closed on schedule as British forces accelerated their withdrawal from the Barron Hotel. In simple words, what the Pentagon has tried to suggest is that America wanted to shut the gates. It knew that something was about to happen, but Britain apparently delayed its withdrawal, so the attack took place and Americans got killed. The United States is indirectly blaming its failure in preventing the attack on the United Kingdom. and the world thought these two countries were best friends. Britain is mighty upset. It says the US is trying to shift the blame. British parliamentarians are lashing out at Washington. Conservative MP Tobias Ellwood, who is the chair of the UK's Defence Select Committee, has said, and I'm quoting, "It does not add up. If the US was anticipating a mass casualty event, why did they still continue processing themselves? There is an underlying current of blame which is unhelpful." Another Conservative leader, Ian Duncan Smith, has said, "It's a domestic issue. It's all about Biden's complete collapse in the run-up to the midterms." Then we have the British Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab. He said, and I'm quoting again, "We got our civilian staff out of the processing centre by Abbey Gate, but it's just not true to suggest that other than securing our civilian staff inside the airport, that we were pushing to leave the gate open." In other words, Britain did not ask Washington to keep the gates open. That's what London says. Even the Prime Minister of Britain has lashed out. Boris Johnson has said, and let me quote again, "It is simply not true to suggest we push to keep the gates open." The UK is not holding back. It does not wish to remain silent because the US allegations are rather serious. If Washington knew that there could be a mass casualty event, if they knew where exactly that event would occur, why then did they not act? And as far as blaming Britain is concerned, wasn't it Joe Biden who said the buck stops with him and that America would not blame its failures on others? The buck passing clearly has not stopped. What's worse, the US is blaming its failure on an ally, its staunchest, longest, most trusted ally. For decades, the US and the UK have fought side by side. Be it Eastern Europe, West Asia, Africa, virtually everywhere Americans were deployed, so were the Brits. Together they freed West Berlin. They forged the NATO, fought in Korea, toppled Saddam Hussein, disarmed Iraq. But they failed to stop the Taliban in Afghanistan. And now they're fighting each other, squabbling in front of the world. And we can say this with confidence. This transatlantic blame game is not ending anytime soon. And as the world focuses on Afghanistan, guess what China is doing? Busy pushing with its world domination plans. They've opened a rail link to the Indian Ocean via Myanmar. It's part of a new transport corridor. It starts from Chengdu in western China and stretches all the way to Myanmar's northeast. The corridor connects the two regions via rail and road networks. Now, on the face of it, China is promising a high-speed trade route to Myanmar, something that would make Myanmar's generals happy. They're getting a trade route, after all, that would make them money. But in reality, China is challenging India's domination in the Indian Ocean. This trade link is something that China has dreamed about since the 1980s. Originally, it was planned to support China's landlocked provinces in the southwest. But now the same project has attained a new strategic importance. The reason is the Malacca Straits. And you must know about this. I'll show you another map. The Malacca Straits is a shallow and narrow waterway near the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. The Malacca Straits is essential to China. Beijing needs this route to remain open. That's because China gets most of its energy supplies from here. More than 70% of China's petroleum and LNG exports are shipped through here. 60% of China's trade flows through this route. It's obvious. The Malacca Straits is China's economic lifeline, a vital link that connects the Indian Ocean with the South China Sea. And India can choke China here just by parking some of its ships near the straits. This is a real problem for Beijing. They call it the Malacca Dilemma. Hu Jintao, the former president of China, had coined the term in 2003. Back then he said that certain quote-unquote major powers are bent on controlling the straits. China knows about the threat, in fact knew about the threat 18 years back. But now it is feeling the heat. Since last year, India has been facing pressure to throttle China's maritime trade that passes through the Malacca Straits. The reason, of course, is the ongoing Ladakh border standoff that started last year. And New Delhi seems to have listened. Recently, India sent a naval task force to the South China Sea. Reports say that this deployment is now, quote-unquote, the most visible show of flag naval presence. Why? Because the Indian task force has been deployed near the Malacca Straits. India is sending a message through this deployment. It is asserting its claim over the region, and Beijing has responded by opening up a new trade route with Myanmar. It will allow Beijing to bypass the Malacca Straits. But remember, 60% of China's trade flows through this route. And just one new trade route is not good enough to solve China's Malacca dilemma. We'll keep tracking this for you. Halfway across the world, this is what's happening in Brazil. They say for criminals, there's no crime more enticing than a bank heist. The fame and money involved is enough to push them into robbing a bank. Some settle for small amounts of money, some choose to rob millions. In Brazil, a group of 20 thieves chose to go wild. Not only did they rob 3 banks, they tied the hostages. Look at this. They tied the hostages to the top of their getaway vehicles as they rolled down the streets, firing shots in the air. Watch this. The prospects for the future of mankind don't look too bright. Who does such a thing? Psychotic criminals. These thieves don't tie the hostages to the roofs for fun. They were trying to use them as human shields so that cops don't fire at them. There's another video which shows a thief walking through the streets with his gun pointed at hostages in front of him. Reports say the thieves then tied these hostages to their cars, drove across the city, left explosives in different areas. How did they evade the police? They used drones to monitor the movement of the police from the air. It was an elaborate plan. Where did this happen? In a place called Aracatuba. This is in Brazil. It is said to be a hotbed for such criminals. In fact, such crazy and creative thefts are a regular affair, we are told. In December 2020, an organized crime gang besieged the city of Criciúma in southeast Brazil. They used hostages as human shields in a similar fashion.
Então, eles estavam lá abaixados, vieram agora aqui trancar aqui na frente de casa aqui, ó, com o furgão. Então é assim, ó, quem vem lá do...
They ransacked several banks, took prisoners, stole a few millions, killed a few policemen, and then left the city in their luxury cars, fast and furious. And 3 years before this, in the city of Sao Paulo, a team of 16 thieves tried to pull off Brazil's biggest attempted bank robbery. They dug a sophisticated 600-meter tunnel equipped with lights and groceries, all the way to a central bank, from which they planned to steal $318 million. Too bad the tunnel was discovered. Now let me show you a graph. It shows the number of robberies in banks and financial institutions that have occurred in Brazil between 2007 and 2018. The average is anywhere close to 600 heists per year. 600. Brazilian criminals are on another level altogether. It's a sad state of affairs. What is the government doing? Perhaps waiting to declare bank heist a profession. Here's what's happening in Sri Lanka. The country has declared a state of economic emergency. There is a massive shortage of essential food supplies. Hundreds of people are lining up outside ration shops just to buy cooking oil. What triggered this crisis? Sri Lanka's economy is suffocating under the burden of Chinese debt. It's bleeding Colombo's coffers. Here's a report.
Sri Lanka has declared an emergency. There is a serious shortage of food supplies. People are standing in long queues for basics. Stuff like rice, sugar, milk powder and cooking oil. Colombo has now decided to press the emergency buttons. The state will now supply essentials. Stocks of staples are being seized, and the Sri Lankan government will now decide at what price they will be sold. What went wrong? Why is Sri Lanka suddenly struggling to provide its citizens with basic food items? The country is running short of foreign exchange. By July this year, they had fallen to $2.8 billion. This money is going toward debt settlement, so Colombo doesn't have enough money to pay for the imports of food items.
The food shortage state of emergency that was declared yesterday is actually a symptom of a much larger macroeconomic problem in the country. And that is the dwindling foreign exchange reserves and the inability to respond to it in a timely and adequate fashion. Sri Lanka is using its foreign exchange reserves to meet its debt and interest rate obligations. As a result, the foreign exchange resources that are actually available to import goods for citizens to consume is limited.
A major crisis is now looming over the island nation. Sri Lanka has to pay $3 billion to its creditors in the next 12 months. Clearly, it doesn't have enough to settle the debt. Where will Colombo get the rest of the money? There's only one option: more loans. And Sri Lanka is borrowing from everyone. They already owe more than $5 billion to China. 2 weeks ago, they took another loan from Beijing. This one was worth $308 million. Bangladesh too is pitching in with a $100 million loan. This is in addition to a loan of $50 million that Dhaka had sent in August. Sri Lanka has sought help from the International Monetary Fund too. It has received $787 million. For how long can Colombo keep this cycle of debt going? More than 80% of the country's revenues are spent on paying off the interest from loans. The island nation is sinking under the weight of China's debt trap, and it's struggling to stay afloat. Bureau Report, World is One.
Let's talk about a worrying trend emerging in Britain. Children on anti-depressants. I know the very thought of it is depressing, but the numbers in Britain cannot be ignored. In 2020, more than 230,000 prescriptions were handed out. 230,000. We're talking about children aged 5 to 16. They are being prescribed antidepressants. Compare this to 2016. Around 190,000 prescriptions were handed out. 190,000 children. This is a 22% rise in 4 years. British kids are taking 600 pill packets a day. This is clearly a crisis. Children do suffer from mental health issues, yes, but are antidepressants the answer? What do the experts say? Pills do help, they say, but they cannot replace therapy. It can only be a last resort. Unfortunately, that's not what's happening in Britain. Reports say mental health issues make up 23% of the disease burden, but the NHS, the National Health Service, spends only 11% of its budget on mental health. The result is this: shortage of psychologists. We all know that therapy takes time. It takes multiple sessions. Britain does not have the capacity for that. In fact, most countries in the world lack that capacity. So psychologists are using the alternative treatment, antidepressants. What impact does this have on children? Here's what the U.S. Food and Drugs Administration says. Antidepressants may cause or worsen suicidal thoughts in children. And this is not a blanket effect. Every child will not have suicidal thoughts, and thank God for it. But clinical trials have noted that there is a change in some of them. So what's the solution here? You cannot blame the psychologists, really, because their calendars are already filled. One option is to invest more in mental health. More psychologists equals more therapy sessions. Even then, the root problem remains. Why are so many children suffering from mental health issues? Because their lives are complicated and unforgiving. We have this romantic view of childhood, that it's simple, it's happy, it's uncomplicated. A few decades back, maybe it was, but not anymore. Today's children face multiple challenges and pressures: broken families, bullying at school, physical abuse, discrimination, all sorts of problems. Add social media, and you have a recipe for mental illness. Parents are often unaware of what their children go through. They struggle with body image, with gender identity, with their social media persona, That's a lot of pressure really for a young mind, for any mind, especially for the young. The result is mental health issues like anxiety and depression. These issues have been exacerbated by the pandemic. Children have been stuck at home for 2 years. No meetups, no school, no outside interactions. This isolation can be deadly for young minds. They stew in depressing thoughts. They spend more time on toxic online platforms. The numbers support this trend. British doctors gave out nearly 250,000 prescriptions. 250,000. And that's just one country. This trend has been observed across Western nations. In the United States, 1 out of every 15 17-year-old is on anti-depressants. 1 out of 15. These numbers are from 2014. Chances are they have increased considerably. The fact is, this is uncharted medical territory. Nobody even talked about children's mental health until a few years back. In most parts of the world, it's still a taboo. And that's part of the problem. Parents have to look out for signs of mental health issues. It could be restlessness, aggressive behavior, change in personality, perhaps an affinity to taking risks. Look for these changes in your children. That's the only way you can get them help. Because remember, prevention is always better than cure. With that, it's a wrap. We're leaving you with Gravitas images. Thanks for watching.
We're entering the military side of the Kabul airport. One of those moments for the Taliban that they have only been thinking of. And today is D-Day, when the Taliban are now ceased to have control over the entire country. I'm standing outside a hangar that says, warning, armed aircraft inside. But what is it in this remaining hangar inside? Let's just have a look. The Taliban here claim and rather vow that they would be repairing all of these.
One World Trade Center, that is the one where the impact.
The cause of India's freedom for many years.
I, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr.
America is a constant work in progress.
As Afghanistan turns into a global flashpoint, WION goes behind the headlines to bring you stories from the ground. From the war-ravaged streets, WION takes you to the heart of the action with dispatches from the graveyard of empires.
Anas Malik in Mazar Sharif for WION World is One.
stay connected with the world through WION. Like the page on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter for new alerts. Instagram for videos and images. And the website for the latest news, views and analysis. WIONews.com. World is one. WION, India's global voice. The channel that brings you the biggest stories from across the world through India's lens. Now available in more than 190 countries worldwide. Because we believe that the world is one. Watch us in Africa, Europe, USA and Canada, South America, Asia Pacific, Middle East and North African regions. Also available on these digital platforms across the world. WION. World is one.
Joe Biden, now the 46th president of the United States, has a full plate in front of him.
Afghanistan has been the heart of American military power.
In a clear warning to China, India's military has now taken control of the country for 1 year.
It says that it's likely to miss by what was happening inside the virology lab in Wuhan.
One ship was able to freeze global trade.
We want love, we want peace, we want equality!
There are a traditional recipe, and it's really very delicious.
Let me show you some pictures you've most probably already seen. 14.2 million women in Afghanistan have been abandoned by their president. 14.2 million women have been abandoned by so-called human rights champions the world over. Today, their tormentors are outside their doors and the world is quoting statements from press conferences. It's sad, it's tragic, it makes you angry. But what do? A lot, I say. We can be their voice. We can tell their stories, their hardships, their bravery, their spirit of resistance. And we plan to do that. Hashtag Save Afghan Women. Write to us, get on social media, organize protests, launch fundraisers. Whichever part of the world you're in, put pressure on your government. Do not let them forget that 14 million Afghan women have been chained by a brutal regime already. We have a chance to save them, but only if all of us join the fight. Write to WION with hashtag Save Afghan Women. Join the Gravitas campaign.
That you see behind me is leading to the Kabul airport. People are desperate to leave, but there are no flights.
The valleys that you see behind me have been attacked by the Afghan Taliban.
To the right, to the left, wherever you see are the Taliban who have taken their positions.
much anticipated, much hyped press conference was being done.
What happens to your relationship with Al-Qaeda? Who will be the leader from the Taliban?
We are still working on it.